Mark, let me start with, if you like, a generic question. Tell us a bit more about the conference of the parties, the role of finance, the role of climate in finance, and the role of business, if you like, more generally. So why don't you give us an overview of what are the discussions in your work nowadays?
The objective for the Glasgow COP, effectively it's a net zero COP. The objective overall is to have the nationally determined contributions of countries to keep that 1.5 degree stretch objective of the Paris COP within reach. So at the core is this mitigation that's anchored around country policies with substantially increased ambition. Very importantly, commitments of capital and policy for adaptation, because the unfortunate reality is we already are 1 degree above pre-industrial levels, and the physical impacts of climate change continue to mount, particularly in the developing world. An emphasis on collaboration on completing the Paris Accord, very important issues around, for example, Article 6 as part of the Paris Accord, but work with indigenous groups, subnational governments, all groups together. And I'm going to finish on this because I think we'll spend most of our time on this. The anchor, one of the pillars of the Glasgow COP is in finance. Now, the first element of finance consistent with Paris COP is to complete the 100 billion per year government-to-government transfers, if you will, that were agreed, pardon me, in Paris. But the work that I'm focusing on and others are very much supporting is to align the private financial system with this objective of net zero. We want to be in a position where the private system has the information, we'll spend a lot of time on that, rightly so today, the tools such as stress testing, portfolio warming techniques and other techniques, and the markets such as voluntary carbon markets or markets for carbon offsets, that it has the 3 of those so that every decision can take climate change into account, and that the private financial system can mitigate those risks by supporting the transition. And there's tremendous momentum around all of those building blocks, but I'll finish with this. The foundation of this, it won't surprise this audience, is information, having proper climate disclosure, and that's why today's subject is so essential.
Let me just give you a premise, because when one thinks about accounting standards, normally, it doesn't relate it to the issue of climate. The classic treatment and the classic understanding of climate is, climate is an externality. It has the negative impact on carbon is not priced, therefore we need a tax. And the main instrument is actually, taxes or fees. But, climate also implies risk and, risk of various natures, physical damage, but also the risk which are related to so-called stranded assets, so that the change in valuation due to, to the fact that a large part of our infrastructure will become, stranded due to the policy that hopefully will be put in place to mitigate the climate risk. So we have this huge risk, which we have a negative externalities, and also we are very uncertain about how this risk will materialize. So clearly we need many instruments, and there has been a lot of discussion on taxes and fees, as I mentioned, but this is not enough. We need the involvement of the private sectors, as Mark said, and we need information. And information is important because it's important for capital allocation. This is what is important information for investors and for capital market participants in general, but not only. So we need disclosure for that reasons, and we need also new tools to deal with the fact that we know that risk is there, is big, is huge, but potentially devastating. But we don't know exactly when and to what extent and so on. So we have to take in consideration this uncertainty. This work of the TCFD is, is basically the basis of this new area of reporting on climate-related risk. It has been quite successful in terms of the number of companies that have adopted the voluntary recommendations. And also it has been quite creative in suggesting new methodologies to deal with the uncertainty related to climate risk. However, today the landscape is still quite chaotic. There are different standards, different recommendations, different organizations involved, and therefore a risk for greenwashing. So we need to consolidate. We need to have global mandatory standards that can be, auditable, and that, this actually will be the pillar of a sustainable financial system. And the IFRS, has opened a public consultation to ask stakeholders, should we get involved? Should we expand the scope of our action in the direction of sustainability reporting? In principle, everybody has told us implicitly you should go for it, but actually for legitimacy reasons, we went through a public consultation. But the reasons that suggest that the IFRS is the right organization to take that role is its governance, because it combines the input of regulators, but also the private sector. And as Mark said, to involve the private sectors in this agenda is actually key. Is also, reputation, because, reputation on the standard settings on the financial account and in due process, it is something, is a good basis to expand on this work. And then also because whatever we are going to do on sustainability standards will have to relate to financial account standard setting, and this is what we can provide.
The TCFD recommendations, which really were only finalized for the Hamburg summit of the G20 3 years ago, less than 3 years ago, there has been quite substantial take-up by a number of companies around the world, and really across the G20. So not just in advanced economies, but also in major emerging economies as well. However, and this goes to your point, or to your question, the application of all of the standards has been uneven. So where there has been the best reporting has been around, the basics, of course, the metrics of, let's call it GHG accounting, so scope 1, scope 2, and as appropriate, scope 3 emissions. The governance of climate-related financial risks, so much greater clarity about who's responsible for identifying and managing those risks, how it's reported up through the board, higher level disclosure around strategy. But where there has been the least progress has been the disclosure on forward-looking strategy, or so-called strategic resilience, and this gets to the heart of what is different about climate-related risk, is that past is not prologue for climate-related financial risks. I mean, this is one of the challenges with a changing climate, is that if you're, and I know this well from the days of insurance regulation, that which was in the tail of the distribution has become in the central scenario. It's also true for companies in terms of their exposure to physical risk, but very importantly, their exposure to transition risk. I would say that the lesson of the last 3 years, just to summarize, is that there is a tremendous appetite for this disclosure by the providers of capital, lenders and investors, and indeed by all stakeholders. There's a proven ability to supply much of it, but there is also, I think the experience demonstrates the limits of a purely voluntary disclosure regime, in that we need comprehensive coverage, not just in geographies, but in the forms of disclosure, or the type of disclosure that's provided, particularly on the forward-looking nature.
This is an effort to go for a global standards, but of course we know that different countries, different jurisdictions have done different things. They've gone in their own way. In particular, the European Union has been extremely ambitious and is leading in this area. So there is this tension that we want to be global, but we don't want to be not ambitious at all, because we have to go at the rhythm of the least ambitious jurisdictions. So what we are trying to do is, to have a kind of a building block strategy in which we, the IFRS, aim at defining a global set of standards that all companies globally will have to comply to, and then jurisdictions will go maybe, at a higher level of ambition. So the problem in this area is that the capital market is global, but the legal frameworks and the politics is local, so that we have to kind of reconcile these things. Second, we are aiming at some point to cover all the different aspects of sustainability, including the social and governance, but we will start with climate, because we recognize that this is the most urgent, and it's challenging enough to start building on that. We will try to consolidate existing efforts, so that we are now working together with existing standard setters to make sure that at the end of this process there will be one global standard setters and not 10 global standard setters. And the fourth is building block approach, which will try to bring on board the European Union and also the US, and all the different, of course, jurisdictions.
There are elements that affect enterprise value of a company, the financial value of a company. There are social, environmental factors that affect the enterprise value of a company. And there are other factors that today affect those environmental and social outcomes, but not necessarily the enterprise value of the company. So let me stick to climate and focus in on, obviously there are physical impacts of climate that can affect the value of commercial real estate, that can affect supply chain, the efficiencies of supply chain can affect demand. There are climate policies that affect the economics of a company and the profitability of a company. And those policies are current and prospective, very important distinction. And those physical effects are current and prospective, as opposed to traditional financial reporting, which is only of the, is backward looking in terms of results, not just also on a forward basis, and does not give the full picture, with a fundamental structural break that is represented by climate change, both in its physical impacts, which are mounting and parabolic on an unaddressed basis, and in terms of climate policy, which the orders of magnitude of what's required to achieve things such as the UK's objective of 68% down on 2005 levels, or Europe's 55% down on 2005 level, are considerable shifts in policy, and therefore the economics of various businesses, positive and negatively. Investors, providers of capital, other stakeholders need to understand those. So that gets to part of the heart of why the additional reporting is required, because the backward-looking reporting will only disclose the extent to which there is impairment of existing assets, and a judgment that which is a very high threshold. One of the issues is the extent to which there are issues that do not affect enterprise value today, but could affect them it in the future, and are so-called dynamically material. And do I, as a stakeholder or including as a capital provider, do I want visibility on those issues so I can make my judgment about whether or not they are material and when they could become material?